He came to talk movies, but one sentence from Stallone made Jimmy Kimmel throw him off the stage in front of a live audience. Welcome to Stalone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The green room pulsed with a manufactured energy, a chaotic ballet of publicists, makeup artists, and nervous assistants fluttering around the periphery. At its center, on a plush but oddly unyielding sofa, sat Marcus Thorne, a man whose stillness was a stark counterpoint to the surrounding frenzy. He wasn't a celebrity in the conventional sense, not a creature of sound bites and practiced charm. He was a historian, a writer of dense, meticulously researched books on forgotten conflicts and the human cost of ideologies. Why he was here on the set of Late Night Live, one of the nation's most popular and often most frivolous talk shows, was a question even he was still grappling with. The invitation had been unexpected, a curious anomaly in his usually quiet, academic life. His latest book, a somber exploration of the lingering psychological wounds of a little-known border war, had against all odds garnered some mainstream attention, a brief flicker of interest in a world usually consumed by lighter fare. He suspected the show's host, the notoriously irreverent and often combative Bryce Callahan, saw him as a novelty, a curiosity, perhaps even a target for his acerbic wit. Marcus nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee, his gaze distant, his thoughts already far from the backstage clamor. In his worn leather briefcase, beside his notes and a copy of his book, lay a small, tarnished silver locket. It wasn't his. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had fought in that forgotten war, a man whose silences had spoken volumes, whose unspoken stories Marcus had spent a lifetime trying to understand and articulate. He carried it not as a good luck charm, but as a reminder of the weight of history, the responsibility of memory. A hairy producer, clipboard clutched like a shield, rushed in. "Mr. Thorne? 5 minutes. Bryce is really looking forward to this. Says your book is intense." The producer's smile was a rictus of practiced enthusiasm. Marcus merely nodded. He had no illusions about Bryce Callahan. The host was a master of the verbal takedown, his interviews often more akin to gladiatorial combat than genuine conversation. He thrived on discomfort, on exposing vulnerabilities, on reducing complex issues to simplistic, often mocking punchlines. Marcus knew he was walking into a potential ambush. His publisher had warned him. His agent had been dubious, but he had agreed to come, not for the fleeting fame, nor for the potential book sales, but because he felt a quiet, stubborn obligation to speak for those whose voices had been silenced by time, by indifference, by the relentless forward march of a world eager to forget its uncomfortable truths. He thought of the locket, its cool, smooth surface of familiar comfort against his palm. It contained a miniature, faded photograph of a young woman with sad, knowing eyes, his grandmother, who had waited and grieved and endured. Their story, and the stories of countless others like them, deserved to be heard, even in a place as unlikely, as potentially hostile as Bryce Callahan's soundstage. He took a slow, steadying breath. He was not a performer, not a showman. He was a historian, a keeper of stories. And he would speak his truth, calmly, quietly, regardless of the reception. The weight of the past, he knew, was a heavy burden, but also a profound source of strength. He was ready, or as ready as he would ever be. The transition from the relative calm of the green room to the sensory overload of the late-night live stage was abrupt, almost violent. A wall of sound, applause, the house band's insistent rhythm, Bryce Callahan's booming, amplified voice, hit Marcus Thorne like a physical force. Blinding lights, the heat from 1,000 unseen lamps, the unnerving gaze of multiple cameras, all converged on him as he walked towards the interview desk. Bryce Callahan, resplendent in a sharply tailored suit that seemed at odds with his deliberately unkempt hair, rose to greet him, his hand outstretched, his face wreathed in a smile that was all teeth and practiced showmanship. "Marcus Thorne, folks." Bryce boomed into his microphone, the studio audience erupting in a fresh wave of applause, cued, Marcus suspected, by an offstage director. Author of the feel-good hit of the season, echoes of the unseen war. Welcome to the show, Marcus. Or should I call you Dr. Doom? Laughter, sharp and a little too loud, rippled through the audience. Bryce's opening salvo. Predictable. Marcus shook the offered hand, his own grip firm, his expression unreadable. He took his seat, the plush armchair surprisingly comfortable, a small island of calm in the surrounding chaos. "Thank you for having me, Bryce," Marcus said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying easily over the receding applause. He didn't rise to the Dr. Doom jibe. He simply stated his presence. Bryce leaned back in his chair, a predatory glint in his eye. "So, Marcus, your book. Not exactly beach reading, is it? All that history, all those sad stories. What possesses a man to spend his life digging around in the dustbins of forgotten misery?" The question was dismissive, designed to belittle, to reduce Marcus's life's work to a morbid eccentricity. The audience chuckled, anticipating the usual Callahan takedown. Marcus met Bryce gaze steadily. "Some stories, Bryce," he said, his voice calm, measured, "deserve to be remembered precisely because they are difficult. Because they remind us of the cost of conflict, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of learning from the past, however painful that past might be." "Whoa, heavy stuff for a Tuesday night," Bryce interjected, feigning shock, playing to the crowd. "But come on, Marcus, isn't it all a bit depressing? Don't people want to be entertained? Don't they want to laugh, forget their troubles for a while?" "There's a time for laughter, Bryce," Marcus conceded. "And there's a time for reflection. My work isn't about dwelling on misery. It's about understanding, about empathy. It's about honoring the lives and experiences of those who endured, those who were silenced." He paused, then added, his voice taking on a new note of quiet intensity. "And sometimes, understanding the past is the only way to truly make sense of the present, to avoid repeating its mistakes." Bryce raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Mistakes? You think we're making mistakes, Marcus? You think this great nation, this beacon of freedom and democracy, is somehow flawed?" He leaned forward, his voice laced with a mocking challenge. "Enlighten us, O wise historian. What terrible sins are we committing now that you, from your ivory tower of ancient battles, can so clearly foresee?" The audience, sensing a confrontation, grew quiet. The atmosphere in the studio, which had been light and frivolous, suddenly became charged, tense. Marcus felt the familiar weight of the locket in his briefcase, a silent reminder of the human cost of such glib dismissals of history. He had known this would be difficult. He had known Bryce Callahan would try to provoke, to ridicule. But he had not come here to be cowed into silence. He had come to speak for the forgotten, and he would not betray their memory. Marcus Thorne did not take the bait immediately. He let Bryce Callahan's mocking words hang in the air, a testament to the host's deliberate provocation. The studio audience, sensing the shift from light-hearted banter to a more serious confrontation, remained uncharacteristically quiet, their attention fixed on the two men at the desk. "It's not about foreseeing sins, Bryce," Marcus said finally, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge of steel. "It's about recognizing patterns. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but often rhymes, as the saying goes. And the patterns of division, of dehumanization, of sacrificing long-term understanding for short-term gain, those are patterns that have led to profound suffering in the past." Bryce scoffed, a theatrical sound of disbelief. "Dehumanization? Suffering? Come on, Marcus, we're talking about a talk show here. People tune in to unwind, to see a celebrity juggle kittens, not to get a lecture on the fall of the Roman Empire." A nervous titter ran through the audience, but it was quickly suppressed. The mood was no longer playful. And yet, Marcus countered, his gaze unwavering. "Even on a talk show, Bryce, there's a responsibility. A responsibility not to trivialize, not to mock things that hold deep meaning for others. Your platform is immense. Your words carry weight, whether you intend them to or not." He leaned forward slightly, his quiet intensity filling the space. "My book explores a conflict that most people have never heard of. Men and women who fought, who suffered, who died for reasons that were complex and often misunderstood. Their stories were buried, ignored, dismissed as unimportant. To bring those stories to light, to give voice to their experiences, that is not about dwelling on misery. It is an act of remembrance, an act of respect. Bryce shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The easy, mocking confidence seemed to have deserted him for a moment. He was accustomed to controlling the narrative, to disarming his guests with wit and ridicule. But Marcus Thorne was not easily disarmed. His quiet conviction, his refusal to be drawn into a shouting match or a battle of insults, was proving to be a surprisingly effective defense. Respect, Bryce finally managed, trying to regain his footing. You're talking about respect for people who've been dead for 50 years? What about respect for my audience, Marcus? What about respect for their desire to be entertained, not preached at? Respect for the past, Bryce, Marcus stated, is not incompatible with engaging the present. In fact, I would argue it is essential. The stories I tell, the lessons they contain, are not just about events that happened long ago. They're about courage, about loss, about the enduring consequences of our choices. These are timeless themes. They speak to the core of what it means to be human. He paused, then added, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal. My own grandfather fought in that war. He carried its scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke of it, but the silence itself was a testament to its weight. My work is, in part, an attempt to understand that silence, to give it meaning. He reached for his briefcase, which was on the floor beside his chair. "May I?" he asked, a polite but firm request. Bryce, momentarily nonplussed, gestured vaguely. "Be my guest. Just don't pull out any actual ghosts, okay?" The effects budget on this show is terrible. The attempt at humor fell flat. The audience remained silent, their attention riveted. Marcus opened his briefcase and took out the small, tarnished silver locket. He held it in his palm, its surface reflecting the harsh studio lights. The air in the studio seemed to grow stiller, charged with an unspoken anticipation. The confrontation was no longer just about words. It was about to become something more tangible, more deeply personal. Marcus Thorne held the silver locket in his open palm, allowing the cameras to focus on it. Its tarnished surface, engraved with a delicate, faded floral pattern, seemed to absorb the harsh studio lights, muting their glare. It was a small, unassuming object, yet in the charged atmosphere of the studio, it seemed to possess an almost talismanic power. "This locket," Marcus began, his voice quiet but resonant, "belonged to my grandfather. He carried it through the war I wrote about in my book. He carried it for over 50 years, until the day he died." Bryce Callahan watched him, his usual smirk replaced by an expression of wary curiosity. The audience was utterly silent, a sea of expectant faces. Inside, Marcus continued, his thumb gently prying open the delicate clasp, "is a photograph of my grandmother. She was young then, her eyes full of a hope that I suspect was severely tested in the years that followed." He held the open locket towards the nearest camera, allowing the viewers at home, and those in the studio, a glimpse of the tiny, faded image within, a young woman's face, beautiful, sad, timeless. She waited for him, Marcus said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. She endured the uncertainty, the fear, the long silences. She raised a family, kept a home, lived a life overshadowed by a war that had stolen a part of the man she loved, a war that most of the world had already forgotten or never even knew existed. He closed the locket with a soft click, the sound echoing in the profound stillness of the studio. "This, Bryce," he said, his gaze locking with the host's, "is not just an old piece of jewelry. It is a symbol. It is a repository of memory, of love, of loss, of an endurance that most of us, in our comfortable, modern lives, can scarcely imagine." Bryce swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He seemed, for once, at a loss for words. The usual arsenal of witty retorts, of dismissive jibes, seemed utterly inadequate in the face of the quiet, powerful emotion emanating from his guest. "My grandfather," Marcus went on, his voice regaining its steady, measured cadence, "was not a hero in the grand, cinematic sense. He was an ordinary man caught up in extraordinary, terrible circumstances. He did his duty, he survived, and he came home, carrying wounds that never fully healed. His story, and the stories of countless others like him, are not sad stories to be dismissed or forgotten. They are vital parts of our collective human experience. They teach us about the cost of conflict, about the importance of peace, about the enduring strength of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable hardship." He paused, letting his words resonate. "To trivialize such experiences, Bryce," he said, his voice dropping, becoming almost a whisper, yet carrying an undeniable force. "To mock the efforts of those who try to understand and honor them is not just disrespectful. It is a disservice to our own humanity. It is an abdication of our responsibility to remember, to learn, and to strive for a better, more compassionate world." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the studio lights. Marcus Thorne, the quiet historian, had not raised his voice, had not resorted to theatrics. He had simply spoken his truth, a truth embodied in a small, tarnished silver locket, and in doing so, he had transformed a late-night talk show into a space of unexpected, uncomfortable, but ultimately vital reflection. Bryce Callahan looked down at his notes, then up at Marcus, his expression a mixture of shock, discomfort, and perhaps, just perhaps, a dawning, reluctant respect. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. The atmosphere on the late-night live stage was thick with a tension that was almost palpable. Bryce Callahan, usually so quick with a comeback, so adept at controlling the flow of any conversation, seemed genuinely flustered. He shuffled his notes, cleared his throat, avoided Marcus Thorne's steady gaze. The audience, too, seemed to be holding its collective breath, unsure how this unexpected turn of events would resolve. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the almost inaudible hum of the studio equipment, a stark contrast to the usual boisterous energy of the show. Finally, Bryce looked up, his face flushed, his usual cocksure demeanor noticeably absent. He attempted a smile, but it was a weak, unconvincing imitation of his usual confident grin. "Well, Marcus," he began, his voice a little hoarse, "that was quite a speech. You certainly, feel very passionately about this." It was a lame attempt to regain control, to downplay the profound impact of Marcus's words. But it fell flat. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply held Bryce's gaze, his own expression calm, unwavering. He had said what needed to be said. He had honored his grandfather's memory, and the memory of all those whose stories had been lost or forgotten. Bryce, sensing that his usual tactics were failing, tried a different approach. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of feigned sincerity. "Look, Marcus, I get it. It's personal for you. Your grandfather, the locket, it's a touching story. And I respect that. I do. But you have to understand, this is an entertainment show. People tune in to laugh, to escape. They don't want to be lectured." "It was not a lecture, Bryce," Marcus corrected, his voice still quiet but firm. "It was an invitation to look beyond the superficial, to consider things that matter, things that have lasting significance. And I believe, perhaps naively, that even an audience seeking entertainment is capable of moments of genuine reflection, of empathy." "But you accused me," Bryce protested, a note of defensiveness creeping back into his voice. "You accused me of being disrespectful, of trivializing things." "I described your actions, Bryce," Marcus stated calmly. "If you felt accused, perhaps that says more about your own conscience than about my words." The studio audience, which had been silent, began to murmur. A few scattered coughs, a shifting in seats. The tension was becoming almost unbearable. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw a producer gesticulating wildly from offstage. clearly signaling for Bryce to regain control, to move to a commercial break. Bryce saw him too. He took a deep breath, his face hardening. The brief flicker of vulnerability, of uncertainty, was gone, replaced by a renewed, almost desperate, assertion of his on-stage persona. "All right, folks," Bryce said, turning to the audience with a forced, overly bright smile. "We seem to have stumbled into some pretty heavy territory here. Not exactly what we planned for a Tuesday night." He chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "But hey, that's live TV for you, right? Always full of surprises." He turned back to Marcus, his eyes now cold, his smile a thin, brittle mask. Marcus Thorne, author of Echoes of the Unseen War, a book that, I'm sure, is very important to someone. The dismissive, condescending tone was back, sharper, more aggressive than before. It was clear that Bryce felt cornered, his authority challenged, and he was lashing out. "We're going to take a quick break," Bryce announced, his voice regaining its usual booming confidence. "When we come back, we'll have a performing dog who can play the ukulele. You don't want to miss that." He gave Marcus a curt, dismissive nod. "Thanks for stopping by, Marcus. It's been memorable." The house band struck up a loud, jarring chord. The applause sign flashed. The studio lights seemed to intensify, blindingly bright. Marcus Thorne sat still, the silver locket still resting in his palm, a silent testament to the truths he had spoken, truths that had, however briefly, pierced the glib, superficial facade of late-night live. The battle had been joined, and Bryce Callahan, it seemed, had chosen his side. The commercial break was a whirlwind of hushed, urgent consultations around Bryce Callahan's desk. Producers, writers, even the network executive who happened to be on set, huddled around him, their faces grim. Marcus Thorne remained seated, a solitary island of calm amidst the storm. He made no attempt to engage, no effort to defend himself further. He had said what he needed to say. The locket lay on the armrest of his chair, its tarnished silver a quiet rebuke to the surrounding chaos. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before, in different contexts, but the pattern was familiar. When uncomfortable truths are spoken, when cherished illusions are challenged, the system often reacts by silencing the messenger, by marginalizing the message. He was not surprised, disappointed perhaps, that Bryce Callahan had chosen ridicule over reflection, but not surprised. The head producer, a woman with a headset clamped permanently to her ear and an expression of perpetual anxiety, approached him. Her smile was strained, apologetic. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice low, "I appreciate you coming on the show. It was a very powerful segment." "Was it?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral. Bryce seemed to find it merely memorable. The producer winced. Bryce is Bryce. He has a certain on-air persona to maintain. Sometimes things get a little heated. Sometimes, Marcus agreed, the truth can be a little heated. "Look," the producer said, her voice dropping further. "We're going to have to adjust the rest of the segment. The ukulele playing dog is a big hit with the focus groups. We need to get to him." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand." He knew this was a polite euphemism for being cut short, for being ushered off stage before he could say anything further that might disrupt the carefully curated flow of light entertainment. "So, if you wouldn't mind," the producer continued, her relief palpable, "we'll just have Bryce thank you again after the break. And then, well, your car will be waiting." "My car," Marcus echoed, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips. "Of course." He picked up the locket, its weight familiar, reassuring in his palm. He had not come here seeking fame or fortune. He had come to speak for the forgotten, to honor a history that deserved to be remembered. If his message had reached even a few people, if it had sparked even a moment of genuine reflection in that vast, unseen television audience, then his purpose had been served. The ukulele-playing dog could have its moment. He would carry his own truths and his grandfather's locket back into the quiet solitude of his own life. As the commercial break neared its end, Bryce Callahan, his composure restored, his on-air persona firmly back in place, received his final instructions from the producers. He glanced over at Marcus, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or a grudging, quickly suppressed respect. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar, predatory grin. The stage manager cued the applause. The house band struck up its Johnny theme. The lights blazed. And we're back. Bryce boomed, his voice dripping with forced enthusiasm. A big thank you again to Marcus Thorne, author of a very thoughtful book. Give him a hand, folks. The applause was dutiful, polite, but lacking the earlier energy. Bryce didn't wait for it to die down. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Get ready to be amazed by the incredible, the unbelievable, the one and only. Fido the Uke Doodle. Marcus Thorne rose slowly from his chair as a small, fluffy dog in a sequin vest was led onto the stage, a miniature ukulele strapped to its back. He didn't wait to be formally dismissed. He simply turned and walked off stage, the cheers for the ukulele-playing dog already beginning to swell behind him. He had been effectively kicked off, silenced by the relentless machinery of light entertainment. But as he walked through the chaotic backstage corridors, the silver locket clutched firmly in his hand, he did not feel defeated. He felt a quiet sense of peace. He had spoken his truth, and sometimes that was all one could do. The aftermath of Marcus Thorne's appearance on Late Night Live was not the explosive media firestorm one might have expected. There were no immediate headlines, no viral clips of the confrontation. The network, adept at damage control, ensured that the more contentious parts of the interview were quietly edited out of subsequent rebroadcasts and online clips. Fido the Uke Doodle, it seemed, was deemed far more palatable for mass consumption. Yet, the ripples of Marcus's quiet defiance spread in more subtle, unexpected ways. A handful of viewers, those who had been watching live, took to social media, not with outrage, but with thoughtful commentary. They spoke of the historian's quiet dignity, of the power of his story, of the discomfort they felt at Bryce Callahan's dismissive treatment. Small online forums dedicated to history and literature began to discuss Marcus's book, Echoes of the Unseen War, with renewed interest. Sales, which had been modest, saw a small but significant uptick. Libraries reported an increase in requests for it. It seemed that Marcus's message, though truncated on air, had resonated with a segment of the audience hungry for something more substantial than ukulele-playing dogs. Marcus himself returned to his quiet life, to his research, to his writing. He received a few emails, a handful of letters, from people who had been moved by his brief appearance, who thanked him for speaking truth to power, however fleetingly. He answered them all, thoughtfully, personally. He harbored no bitterness towards Bryce Callahan or the show. He understood the pressures, the demands of that world. His purpose had not been to win a public argument, but to honor a history, to give voice to the silenced. And in that, he felt he had succeeded. The silver locket, his grandfather's legacy, remained a constant presence, a reminder of the stories that still needed to be told, the truths that still needed to be defended. He continued his work, his commitment to uncovering and illuminating the forgotten corners of the past undiminished. Several weeks later, he received an unexpected package in the mail. There was no return address, but the postmark was from the city where Late Night Live was filmed. Inside, nestled in a simple box, was a brand new, beautifully crafted fountain pen. Tucked alongside it was a small and signed card. On it, in a bold, vaguely familiar handwriting, were just two words, "Keep writing." Marcus Thorne held the pen, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. He didn't need to know who had sent it. He understood the message, the echoes of that forgotten war, and the quiet historian who had dared to speak of them in a place of noise and distraction had, it seemed, left a more lasting impression than anyone might have anticipated. The truth, he knew, had a way of enduring long after the spotlights had faded and the applause had died down. And he, with his new pen and his old locket, would continue to be its faithful scribe. The incident on Late Night Live, though quickly swept under the rug by the network, had a curious, lingering effect on Bryce Callahan. Outwardly, he was unchanged, his on-air persona as brash and irreverent as ever. He continued to mock, to provoke, to prioritize easy laughs over substantive discussion. But those closest to him, the writers, the producers, the long-suffering assistants, noticed a subtle shift. He became, they observed, a little less predictable, a little more prone to moments of uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. Occasionally, during a pre-show meeting or a post-show debrief, he would fall silent, his gaze distant, as if wrestling with some unspoken question. Once, during a segment with a particularly vapid reality TV star, Bryce, instead of his usual sarcastic jabs, found himself asking a surprisingly earnest question about the fleeting nature of fame and the search for genuine meaning. The reality star was, of course, utterly flummoxed, and the segment quickly devolved into awkwardness. But the shift in Bryce's approach did not go unnoticed by his team. He never spoke of Marcus Thorne again, at least not publicly. But the memory of the quiet historian, the tarnished silver locket, the unwavering conviction in those steady eyes seemed to have lodged itself somewhere deep in Bryce's carefully guarded psyche. It was as if a small seed of doubt, of introspection, had been planted in the barren soil of his cynicism. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, continued his work, oblivious to these subtle shifts in the distant world of late-night television. His book found its way into the hands of a new generation of readers, sparking discussions in classrooms, in book clubs, in quiet corners of libraries. The forgotten war he had chronicled began, slowly, to be less forgotten. He received an invitation to speak at a prestigious historical society, then another at a university. His voice, quiet but resonant, was finding its audience, not through the glare of television lights, but through the more enduring channels of scholarship and thoughtful discourse. He still carried the locket. It remained a touchstone, a reminder of the human cost of conflict, the importance of memory. He never learned for certain who had sent him the fountain pen, though he had his suspicions. He used it every day, its smooth, steady flow of ink, a fitting instrument for a man dedicated to bringing the stories of the past into the light of the present. The world of Late Night Live and the world of Marcus Thorne remained, for the most part, separate universes. But for one brief, charged evening, those universes had collided, and the impact, though largely unseen, had been real. A quiet historian had spoken his truth, and in doing so, had perhaps, just perhaps, reminded a jaded showman, in a world too often consumed by the trivial, of the enduring power of things that truly matter. The ukulele-playing dog might have gotten the applause, but Marcus Thorne and the stories he carried had touched something deeper, something more lasting. Years passed. Late Night Live continued its reign, Bryce Callahan still at its helm, though perhaps a little more subdued, a little less predictable in his barbs. Fashions changed, celebrities rose and fell, new scandals erupted and faded. The relentless cycle of popular culture churned on. Marcus Thorne, too, continued his work. He published several more books, each one a testament to his meticulous research, his profound empathy, his unwavering commitment to uncovering the human stories behind the grand, impersonal narratives of history. He became a respected, if not widely famous, voice in his field, his quiet integrity earning him the admiration of colleagues and readers alike. He never sought the spotlight again, content to let his work speak for itself. One day, an elderly Bryce Callahan, long retired from the relentless grind of late-night television, found himself browsing in a dusty, second-hand bookstore. His eyes, no longer lit by the harsh glare of studio lights, but by the softer, more forgiving light of late afternoon sun filtering through a grimy window, fell upon a familiar title, Echoes of the Unseen War by Marcus Thorne. He picked it up, the weight of it surprisingly substantial in his now frail hands. He opened it, his gaze falling upon the author's photograph on the inside flap, the same steady, unwavering eyes he remembered from that long-ago, uncomfortable interview. He bought the book. That evening, in the quiet solitude of his study, a room filled not with the ghosts of televised laughter, but with the silent companionship of well-loved books, Bryce Callahan began to read. He read slowly, thoughtfully, the words of the quiet historian painting vivid, poignant pictures of a forgotten conflict, of ordinary lives shattered by extraordinary circumstances. He came to the passages about the author's grandfather, about the silver locket, about the enduring power of memory and love in the face of loss. And as he read, something shifted within him, a final, quiet surrender of the cynicism he had worn for so long like a suit of armor. He understood, finally, what Marcus Thorne had been trying to say that night, not with anger or accusation, but with a profound, sorrowful wisdom. He closed the book, his eyes a little moist. He thought of the fountain pen, the anonymous gift he had sent all those years ago. He hoped Marcus Thorne had understood its message. He hoped the quiet historian was still writing, still speaking for the forgotten, still reminding the world of the truths it so often chose to ignore. In his own way, Bryce Callahan, the former king of late-night mockery, had finally, belatedly, become one of Marcus Thorne's most attentive, most receptive listeners. The echo of that unseen war, and the quiet voice that had dared to speak of it, had, after all these years, found its mark. Marcus Thorne never knew of Bryce Callahan's late-life conversion. He continued his work, his days filled with research, writing, and the quiet satisfaction of bringing forgotten stories to light. The silver locket remained his constant companion, a tangible link to his grandfather's past, and a symbol of his own commitment to memory and truth. He often thought of that strange evening on Late Night Live, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached amusement. It had been an unlikely forum for his message, a fleeting, almost surreal encounter between two vastly different worlds. Yet it had in its own way been significant. It had tested his resolve, reaffirmed his purpose. It had reminded him that even in the most superficial of settings, there was always an opportunity, however small, to speak for something of lasting value. He never achieved widespread fame. His books were respected in academic circles, cherished by a discerning readership, but they never topped any bestseller lists. He never won any prestigious television awards. His victories were quieter, more personal. The grateful letter from a descendant of a soldier whose story he had uncovered. The thoughtful question from a student in one of his occasional university lectures. The dawning understanding in the eyes of someone who, through his work, had come to see the past, and perhaps the present, in a new, more compassionate light. These were the rewards that mattered to him. One day, while sorting through his grandfather's old papers, he came across a small, faded photograph he had never seen before. It was of his grandfather as a young man, dressed in a slightly ill-fitting uniform, standing beside a group of his fellow soldiers. They were all smiling, a heartbreakingly innocent bravado in their eyes, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Tucked into the back of the photograph was a tiny, pressed flower, its petals still retaining a faint, ghostly trace of color. It was a forget-me-not. Marcus Thorne held the photograph, and the tiny flower, his heart aching with a familiar, profound sorrow, but also with a deep, abiding love. He thought of the locket, of the fountain pen, of the ukulele-playing dog. He thought of Bryce Callahan and the countless, unseen individuals whose lives were touched, in ways large and small, by the stories we choose to tell and the stories we choose to remember. His work, he knew, was far from over. There were always more echoes to uncover, more silences to explore, more truths to be spoken. And he, Marcus Thorne, the quiet historian, would continue to listen, to write, to remember. For in the end, that was all that truly mattered. The spotlight, he had learned, was fleeting, but the truth and the courage to speak it endured.